Now we've seen how to actually get data from our collection and show that data on the page. The next step is to save data to the database using this form right here. So in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is attach an event listener to this form to listen for the submit event. So let's do that first of all. We need a reference to the form, which is right here. It doesn't have an ID or class, but it is the only form on the page. So we can say const event. So let's do that first. First of all, we need a reference to the form, which is right here. It doesn't have an ID or class, but it is the only form on the page. So we can say const form is equal to document.query selector. I'm not sure I've spelt this correctly. Yes, I have. And then we want the form. So now we have a reference to that form. Down here, underneath where we get the documents, I'm going to do a new comment to say add documents, and we need to attach an event listener first of all to the form. So we'll say form.add event listener, and the event we want to listen to is the submit event. Now when this happens, we fire a callback function and we are going to take in the event object as a parameter. So the first thing we need to do is prevent the default action. E.prevent default does that. That stops the page from reloading. Then the next thing I want to do is say const now is equal to a new date. Now why am I doing this? We're getting the date, the exact time that a user is submitting this form. And I'm doing that because over in the collection, we store the created at property right here, which is a timestamp. So that is when the recipe was added. So that's why I need to get the date now so we know when this recipe was added, and we're storing it in this variable right here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is construct some kind of object that represents this recipe. Remember, when we talked about documents inside this collection, we talked of these as objects because they have key value pairs. Now, when we actually save a document to this Firestore database, what we do is we actually pass it a JavaScript object, and it takes that JavaScript object and it saves it as a document. So our JavaScript object is going to have to look something like this, where we have an author property, a created at property, which is a firebase timestamp, and also a title property. So let's create an object that looks like that and call it recipe. So we'll say const recipe and set this equal to an object. Now inside that object, we need those three different properties. So I'm going going to say title is whatever a user types in. Now that is from this input field right here. Now if we have a look at that in the HTML, this has an ID of recipe. So what we could say is form, which is the reference from the form, dot recipe, which is the ID of the input field. Remember, we can do this to get a reference on that field, then we want the value from that field. So that gets us the value they type in. The next thing we need is the created at property. And that is going to be this thing right here. However, we don't just want to pass a date to this thing right here because this is a firestore timestamp. It's different from a date. It's a special object in Firestore. So how do we create one of those from a date? Well, the way we do that is by first accessing the firebase object from the firebase library. Remember, we have access to that because we load it in right here. Then on that, we're going to say .firestore to access the Firestore library. Then we want a timestamp, and that is a capital T. And then we want that from a date, so we use a method called from date, and then we pass in the date that we want this from, and that is this thing right here, so I can just pass in now, and that creates a timestamp object for us based on this date. So when we're storing this now, it's going to store a timestamp object as the created at property. Now then, the other property over here was author. Now, we don't actually technically need this because we're not outputting the author anywhere. And actually, when we save something to a collection like this, we don't actually need to specify all of the properties. If we don't specify them, it will just leave it empty. So we can just specify these two and have done with it. Okay, so now we have that recipe object. The next thing to do is go out and get a reference again to this collection, recipes, because that's where we want to add the document to. So we'll say DB, which is our database reference. Then we'll say dot collection, which is a method to get a collection. We want the recipes collection. Then once we have that, we use a method called add. And this method is what we use to add a new document to a collection. Now, what do we pass in here? Well, we pass in a JavaScript object that represents that document, and we just created that right here. It's called recipe. So let's pass in that object. So this again is asynchronous. It takes some time to do, and it's going to return a promise which will resolve or reject at some point. So we can tack on the .then method, which will fire a callback function when it's done. Now, we're not going to take in any parameter here because we're not trying to get data from the database. We just want to fire this when the recipe has been added. And all we'll say is console.log recipe added at this point, just so that we know as a developer that this recipe has now been added to the database. At the end, we're going to tack on a .catch method just in case there is an error, and we'll take that error into a call function and log that to the console. So we'll say console.log and error. Okay, so now let's give this a whirl. Hopefully this will work when we submit the form, prevent the default action, create the new date, create the recipe object based on the value they type in, and a timestamp object, and then we're accessing the recipes collection, adding that new recipe, and then when this is done, we're firing this to the console. So let me save it and go over here. Now we're going to add a new recipe. So I'll just call this a vegan pie and press add. And we see we get an error. And that's because I stupidly called it cathc instead of catch. So I don't know why I always do this. Let me save that again and refresh. Now, even though we got an error, we can see this still added to the database. Let me do another one. I'm going to say veggie curry and save that. And now we can see recipe added. But notice that we don't automatically see it over here. We have to now refresh the page to get that. But before we do, let's go to the database and we can see the 4 documents in here now that we've added. So this did all work over here when we got the value and we got the timestamp. Then we added it to that collection. That all worked, and we can see those documents over here. If I just get one of the new ones, we can see vegan pie and this timestamp, and we can see veggie curry and this timestamp as well. So that works, but it doesn't automatically show over here, and that's because when we get the documents, that is at the start of the page load. That is when we get it, when we first run this file. So when we add a new document down here, we're not automatically then going out and getting the documents again. We're only doing that at the start. So to see it, we're going to have to refresh the page, and now we see the veggie curry as well. So we are going to combat this later when we look at real-time updates. But before we do that, I want to show you also how to delete documents from the database as well. So now we've seen how we can get data from the database using the get method, and we've also seen how we can add new documents to the database using the add method. I want to show you a third thing we can do, and that is to delete documents. So what I'd like to do is output some kind of little button in each one of these li tags, and when we click on that button, it's going to delete that document from the database. So first of all, we need to come over to our template that we output for each recipe, and we want to create a button for each one that we can click on. So let me create this button tag first of all. Inside, I'm going to say delete. And we're also going to add a few bootstrap classes just to make this look a bit better. The first one is btn to make it look like a button. Then btn-danger, that colors it red. Then btn-sm, and also my-2 to give it margin in the y direction of 2. So if I save this now, we should see those in the template. And when I click on these, I want to get that recipe and delete it from the database. So how am I going to do this? Well, first of all, we need to attach some kind of event listener to these buttons. Now, to attach a different listener to each button, that would be quite costly, especially if we have a lot of different recipes, because we're attaching a lot of events over and over again. Instead, what I'm going to do is use event delegation. So we'll just attach one event listener to the whole UL, the whole list, and then when we click on that, we'll check to see if we've clicked on a button. If we have, then we'll go about deleting that recipe. All right, so let's go down here and create another comment which says deleting data, and then under that, we'll grab the list, which we already have a reference to. That's the UL right here. So we're attaching an event listener to that list. So we'll say add event listener, and the event we want to listen for is a click event. Now we do need to take in the event object as a parameter to this callback function because we need to ultimately check the target. So what I'm going to do is console.log e for now, just so we can see every time we click somewhere what happens. So if I click over here, just anywhere in the UL, we can see we get this logged to the console. And if we scroll down to the target property, which is down here somewhere, we can see that this is the LI. So I just clicked anywhere in the LI. Now, if I click on one of the buttons, if I expand this, then go down to target, I can see that the target was in fact the button. So what I'm going to do is check inside here to see if the target was a button, because that's when we want to delete something. So let's do that. I'll say if, then e.target, then .tag name, and I'm going to see if that is triple equals to button. So if the tag that we click on is a button, then we're going to do something. If it's not, we're not going to do anything. So what do we need to do here? We need to delete that recipe. But how do we know what recipe we actually want to delete? Because all we've got here is the title and the timestamp. Now, based on that, we can't go out and query the DOM and say, okay, delete something with this title, because there might be multiple things with that title or multiple things with this timestamp. Instead, what we'd like to do is make use of these unique IDs on each document. So whenever we create a new document in Firestore, it automatically assigns it this unique ID, and no two are the same. So if we have access to these on the front end, then we could say, okay, we'll use this ID to go out and delete that recipe. So first of all, we need to somehow store the ID in each li tag. How are we going to do that? Well, all we're going to do is grab this ID when we first receive the data back. So when we get each document right here, we also get access to the ID on that document, and I can demo that by logging it to the console. I'm going to say, oops, and this needs to be in lowercase, not capitals, console.log, and then doc.id. And we use the ID property on the doc to get that. So let's save it and have a look. And now we can see each one of these IDs. So what we could do is pass this ID right here as a second argument into the add recipe function. So if I do that, we can take it as a parameter up here in the add recipe function. We'll take the ID for each recipe as well, and then we can output it inside the li tag somehow. So what what I'm going to do is use a data-id attribute. So I'm going to set that equal to this thing right here, and that is $ curly braces ID. So this attribute right here, you can call whatever you want. It starts with data. That's how we do it in HTML, custom data attributes, then hyphen, then whatever attribute name you want. I'm calling it ID because that is logical to do so. So if we save this now, for each recipe, we should see the ID of that recipe inside this attribute. So let me save it and inspect one of these. And if we go to the Elements tab, we can see each LI now has one of these data ID attributes with the ID of that document that's stored in the database. So now when we click on one of these buttons, what we could do is traverse up the DOM to the parent, find the ID, and then what we could do is query the database for that document with the ID and delete it. And that is exactly what we're going to do. So let's go back down here where we check if the tag name is a button when we first click something. This is the point that we want to get the ID. So let's say the const ID is going to be equal to the e.target, which is the button that we clicked on. Then what we want to do is get the parent element, which is going to be the li tag. So if I click this button right here, it will get this li. If I click this button, it will get this li, etc. So let's do that. We'll say dot parent element. Then from that, we want to get an attribute because we want that data ID attribute. So we'll say data hyphen ID, and we need to surround this in parentheses like so. So now we have the ID of the recipe that we ultimately want to delete. I'm going to just log this to the console so we can see it. Console.log ID, save. Then when we click on a delete button, we can see the ID that we want to delete. And for each button, we're getting a different one. And that marries up to whatever document we want to delete right here. So now we have the ID, how do we reach out to this collection and delete a document? Well, first of all, we need to say db down here, .collection, to get a reference to that collection. So we'll say db.collection and pass in an argument, which is recipes, the collection that we want. Then we want to get a reference to a single document. Now we do that by using the doc method. So .doc, like so. And as an argument, we pass in the ID that we want a reference to. So if I pass in this ID right here, then what it's going to do is get a reference to whatever document has that ID that we click on over here. So now we have that reference to the ID, the document that we click. What we can do is use a method on this called delete to delete that document. Now again, this is asynchronous. It takes some time to complete and it returns a promise. So when it's done, we can fire the function inside the then method, and inside here we'll just say console.log and we'll just say recipe deleted, just so we know. Alright, let's save this, cross our fingers, hope it works, and try to delete something. So I'm just going to refresh to make sure we catch all those changes. Then I'm going to delete the top one, which is vegan pie. So we can see now a recipe deleted, and if we come over to the database, now we see 3, and if we cycle through these, we can no longer see the vegan pie. Now again, the change doesn't automatically show here because we get the documents when the page first loads, and we've deleted something after the page loads. We'd have to currently refresh to see that change. But it still works. This whole functionality of deleting something from the database is still working. So just really quickly again, we're clicking on a delete button, and that is firing this event right here because we're attaching this to the UL. Then we're checking if the tag is a button. Then we're getting the ID from the parent of that tag, which is the li tag. Remember, we attached that ID inside this thing over here, which we got back down here. So we're getting the ID, and then we're getting a reference to the recipes collection, a single document with the ID, then we're deleting it. So that's the three main things now that we can do with the database that I've shown you. We can get data, we can add data, and we can delete data. But again, when we do these things, it's not automatically updating in the browser, and that functionality would be nice. And to do that, we're going to have to explore real-time listeners. So we'll do that in the next lecture. So now we've seen how to add and delete documents, but when we do something like this, our UI is not automatically updating. It would be nice if we could keep our UI or template in sync with our Firestore data. Now, a Firestore database has real-time capabilities to do this. And by that, I mean we can set up a real-time listener in our JavaScript code, and that listener will actively listen at all times to our database collection. Then when something changes in the collection, like a new document added or a document removed, it will get that update back and we can update the UI with it. Now, this is one of the best advantages of using Firestore as a database. So let's see this in action. The first thing we need to do is get rid of all of this stuff where we actually get the documents initially, because this is a one-time retrieval. It just gets them at the start, and what we want to do is get them every time there's some kind of changes. So let's first of all delete all that. Now what we want to do is set up a real-time listener. Again, we need a reference to the collection, so we say db.collection and we pass in as an argument the collection we want a reference to, which is recipes. Then to set up a real-time listener, we use a method called onSnapshot. Now this fires a callback function and takes in the snapshot when this happens. Now, what is happening here? Well, every time the collection changes in any way, Firestore takes a snapshot of that collection, and the snapshot represents the state of that collection at that moment in time. So we're saying here on snapshot, which means every time you take a snapshot, or every time there is a change in the database and you take a snapshot, then fire this callback function and send us that snapshot. And this snapshot is going to contain information about the state of the collection at that moment in time. And on that snapshot, we can see all the data changes. So let me just now console.log this to the console and save it. Then have a look over here. So now we see right here, when we first load the web page, we get this initial snapshot. So if we open this, we can see down here, we have the docs, and that's an array of 3 things right here. Now also, if we open up this proto, we can see this method called docChanges. Now this method, docChanges, gets us all the changes in the database that's happened. So every time there's a change, it sends us this snapshot, and we can use this method to see the changes inside the Firestore database. So let me just use this and log out the results. I'm going to say snapshot.doc changes like so. Save that and refresh, and now we can see this array. So this is the initial snapshot document changes. So if we expand this, we can see 3 objects, and each object represents a single change. So since this is our first snapshot and we had nothing before it, it considers the initial documents inside the collection that we already have, over here, as changes when we first load the application. Now these changes are seen as added documents, hence the type value, meaning since the last snapshot, these documents have been added. Now, like I just said, this is our first snapshot, which is why it considers these changes to be added since our last one, because we didn't have one before. So initially, when we first load an application and use a real-time listener, it sends us an initial snapshot with 3 changes, or however many documents we have in here, that number of changes, and each one of those changes is considered added, because it's the first time we have seen them since we've loaded the page. Now, every time the data changes after this, we'll also see a new snapshot, and we'll also see a new document change, because every time we get a snapshot now, we're going to log out the document changes. So if I now try to add something, I'm just going to say test and press enter. Now I can see a new array with that document change. So we can see it's an added type. Now, if I was to go over here and now delete one, let me just find the one I just added, which is here. I'm going to now delete this by going up here and saying delete document. Now, when that happens, because we're listening to it, we get another change. And we can see now the type is removed. So now every time something happens, we're being notified that that is happening inside this callback right here. So what we could do is take that information and then apply it to our UI. So every time we add something, we call the function up here to add that recipe to the UI. Every time something is removed, we call a function to remove that from the UI. And we need to make that function later. But the first thing we need to do is check the type of document changes we have in here. Initially, they're all added, but every time thereafter, it could be added or removed. Now, if it's added, we want to add a recipe. If it's removed, we want to remove a recipe. So let us first of all delete this. Then I'm going to say snapshot dot doc changes, which is all of the changes we just saw. That's a function. This gets us an array of the document changes, and what we're going to do is cycle through these using for each, because every time we get something back, it's an array. So we need to cycle through those using for each, even though sometimes there's only one change. So we're doing this and we're going to fire a function for each one. Now we take that individual change object in each time. You can call this what you want, by the way. I just call it change because it represents a document change. And what I want to do is get that document, because at the minute, if I just say console.log the change, then we just see the change objects, these things. I actually want this property right here, the doc property, because that gets us the document reference. So what I'm going to do is say const doc is equal to the change.doc, and that gets us the actual document. So if I now say console.log, the doc, this is the actual document rather than just the change. So we have a reference to that document. Then we need to check the change type. Is it added or is it removed? So we'll say if, and then the change.type, because remember we have on this change a type property, and if that is equal to added, first of all, this is when we want to add that document, and we want to call this add recipe function. So at this point, what we need to do is come down here and say add recipe, and we want to pass in the doc.data as the first parameter, and that gets us the actual recipe, so the things with the title and the created app properties. On it. As the second argument, we want to pass in the ID. So that is doc.id, and remember doc we get from here. Okay, so that's the first thing. So now if I was to say save this, because we're getting these initial snapshots for the first items in it and they're all of type added, then we're going to call add recipe for each one of those documents and pass in the data and the ID, and it should output those to the browser. So let me save it and preview, and now we can see them right here. Now we need to do the same thing for deleted. So now we'll say else if, and then change.type is now equal to removed, then we want to remove that document. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to create a new function called delete recipe to do that. So let me say const delete recipe, set it equal to an arrow function, and inside this arrow function we want to delete a recipe. Now when we call this function, we need to pass in the ID of whatever document we want to remove from the DOM. Remember, we're not actually removing it from the Firestore database. That's already happened. We're deleting it from the Firestore database down here. And when that happens and we get that change back, which is of type removed, now we just want to delete it from the template, the UI. That's all we're doing. In here. So if we pass in the ID right here and take it as a parameter, then what we could do is look inside our list for whatever li tag has that ID right here. If it has that ID, then we can remove it from the DOM. So what I'm going to do first of all is get a reference to all of the li tags. I'm going to say const recipes is equal to document.query selector all, because we want all of them, and we want all of the li tags on the page. So that gets us a collection of all of these li tags. Then we want to cycle through those. So to do that, we'll say recipes.forEach, and then for each item, and we'll call each one a recipe, we want to fire a function. Now in this function, we want to check if this particular recipe, if this li tag has a date ID attribute equal to whatever ID we pass in. If it does have the same ID, then we want to remove that recipe from the DOM. Does that make sense? So let's do that. Let's do this if check. We'll say if, and then the recipe, which we currently are cycling over, if that dot get attribute, and the attribute we want is the data-id, so we're getting the ID of that li tag, which is this thing over here, and if that is equal to this ID we pass in to the function, so we'll say triple equals to ID, then we want to remove it from the DOM. So we'll take that recipe, which is the li tag, and use the remove method to remove it from the DOM. So now we're doing this, we need to call this function from down here if the change type is removed. So what I'm going to say down here is delete recipe and pass in the ID, which is doc.id. So let's save this and give this to whirl, come over to the browser. And first of all, if I add something, I'm going to say test and add. We can see that output right here. And now if I delete something, then we can see it delete in real time. So now this is all working thanks to this real-time listener right here, where we get a snapshot every time something changes, and then we can cycle through all of those changes using for each. For each change, we can check the type of change. If it's added, then we can add the recipe to the UI. If it's removed, then we can delete the recipe from the UI. So then, in the last video, I showed you how to use this real-time listener on Snapshot to listen to changes in the database collection. Now, what if at some point we wanted to stop listening to those changes? Then what we could do is unsubscribe from those changes. So say for example, I go to the index page and down here, I just want to add out a button. I'm going to do it at the bottom of the container. So just a button tag that says unsubscribe from changes. Now, if I click this at any point over here, I want to stop listening to the database for any real-time changes so that if I delete something or add something, it's no longer going to update in real time. So to do that, what we do is come to where we've set up the real-time listener over here. And we say const, and then you can name this what you want. I'm going to call it unsub is equal to this thing right here. So what this does, when we set up a snapshot listener, it actually returns a function. And now we're storing that function in this constant called unsub. Now, if ever we were to later on invoke that function unsub, what it does is cancel this real-time listener. It unsubscribes from changes. So let's do that whenever we click on that button over here. So first of all, we need a reference to that. I'm going to say const button is equal to documents.query. Selector, and we want to pass in the button and save that. So now we have a reference to this. Now we need to attach an event listener. So we'll do that right at the bottom. I'm just going to do a little comment to say unsub from database changes. And now I'm going to say button.add event listener, and we want to listen for a click event, then we fire a callback function when this happens. Now inside this callback function, all we want to do is take this function that was returned to us and invoke it. So let's do that. We'll say unsub and then invoke that function. I'm also going to log something to the console just to say we've done this. Console.log unsubscribed from collection changes. Okay, so now if we save this, what I'm going to do first of all is just add a couple of things, test2, and then I'm going to delete a couple of things as well. So now if we unsubscribe from changes, now we're unsubscribed, and if I try to add something now, I'm going to say tofu pie, press enter. Now we don't see those real-time updates. If I delete something, we don't see those real-time updates. These things are still happening. We're still adding and deleting the recipes from the database. It's just that now we're no longer listening to those events, and so we're not updating our UI when they happen. If I was to refresh, we would see these different things. So for example, if I now say something like test and add, then unsubscribe from changes, then press delete, we don't see the update here, but if I refresh, then we can see it has actually been deleted. So that's how we unsubscribe from changes. We store the function that is returned to us from this real-time listener inside a constant or a variable of some description. Then we invoke that later on when we want to unsubscribe, and this will come in handy later on. So there is much more to Firestore databases than what I've shown you in this chapter, but to explain everything would take a whole course in itself. But hopefully now this gives you a good introduction and a foundation to build upon, and we will be using everything we've learned in this chapter in the next chapter to build a live chat application.